Hi, it's nice to be here, and I'm really happy that you all doing this conference, because precarious work is one of the most timely and pressing issues of our time, and the fact that you all are interested in this makes me very not only. I'm not really happy about the idea of precarious work, but the fact that people are talking about it is great. So following Randy Weingarten's conjunction that you can't really fight something unless you understand it, I'm going to continue trying to set the context for understanding this issue. And so let me be brief and talk about a variety of different things having to do with precarious work. Following what Leah said, precarious work can be defined very generally as work that is uncertain, insecure, but the key is that risks have been shifted from the employers and the state to workers. Good example of this that we've all experienced is the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, but we see it in a lot of other different aspects as well. The precarious work is often low paid and often dead end. Now, and Leah's given some examples of this. So we've got temporary work, some contract work, independent contracting, some involuntary part-time work, gig work, which is hot right now as a term. It's not clear how extensive it is, probably not very, but that's an example of precarious work. But I think the real source of precarious work is really what we might have called a standard employment relationship in the past, and what Leah Vasco has called a degraded SER. Stanley Aronowitz wrote a book a few years ago called The Last Good Job in America, referring to the American professoriate. And that last good job isn't so good anymore. And the statistics you heard is that now 70% approximately of the higher education faculty are in one or another form of precarious work, adjunct faculty and so on. Okay. So let me just make a couple of points about this. First of all is that precarious work is not new. If we go back in American history, for example, to the 1870s, you got the Gilded Age, followed by the Progressive Era, then followed by the New Deal. This was a period dominated by economic liberalism, just as it is now. And work was very precarious during those days. In fact, the New Deal was designed to create social protections that protected people from these precarious forms of work. And then we entered World War II, and then the 30 years after World War II was the period of Pax Americana, high economic growth and stability. This was the heyday of the so-called SER. It was dominated, most of the people who benefited from this standard employment relationship, of course, were white men, because the SER was predicated on a male breadwinner, female homemaker model. There were people excluded from the New Deal and from this SER. We're thinking now of domestic labor, farm labor, and so on, but that was the employment norm of that period. But then what happened was in the mid-1970s, there was a rise of precarious work for factors that I'll talk about in a minute. But what happened as a result of these macro-structural factors is that we had to switch back to the economic liberalism of the pre-World War II period. And so we were overturning the kinds of social protections that the New Deal was designed to provide. Now, so precarious work is really the norm in American society. It was the 1945-1975 period that was the unusual period. However, precarious work is now different in some ways from the earlier period. Among other things, we have a dramatic expansion of it. We've got the reorganization of entire economic sectors in terms of a precarious kind of format, especially the higher education sector, and that, of course, is the theme of this conference today. So what were these forces producing the the precarious work period. And I will date this in the United States to about the mid-1970s. Some of us, or most of us, remember the oil shocks, the Arab oil shocks, which created huge gas lines. It also drove up the price of oil. It created stagflation. And that led to growing international competition in the mass production industries. You saw it in autos, you saw it in steel, and in a variety of other mass production industries. And so the comfortable situation of American industry in the post-World War II period was now under threat as international competition became a real threat. At the same time, you had technological advances, in particular the invention of the microchip. Remember, 1981 was the first IBM PC. And the microchip and the computer processing made it possible to spatialize, to shift capital, to shift labor, and to shift products all over the world through the facilitation of this technology. So in response to these competitive pressures, you had the development and the rise of a new political economic philosophy in the United States, which we might call neoliberalism, a philosophy which emphasizes the importance of private markets as decision-making power. And so what we have here is the privatization of many, many formerly public activities, and we had, very importantly, the deregulation of markets. This started under Jimmy Carter, but it bloomed under Ronald Reagan's presidency starting in the 1980s, in which there was an enormous amount of deregulation and a shift back toward a dominant cultural theme in the United States, which was individualism. Individualism was always rooted in the bedrock of American society. We had a period during the New Deal in which a collective identity emerged, but that was shattered by this neoliberal revolution starting in the mid-1970s and coming full-blown in the 1980s, in which people were urged to take care of their own lives. Pack your own parachute. You're in charge of you, me Inc. You should be responsible for your health insurance. You should be responsible to develop skills and so on. And connected with all of this, of course, was the continued decline of unions. Unions, which had its heyday in the 50s and earlier, always acted as a countervailing force on business and government during the post-World War II Labor Capital Accord. But once the ascendancy of the business community occurred, starting with Reagan, and you have this incredible amount of international competition, there was an incredible push for flexibility, and one of the causes of this, as well as a consequence, was the decline of unions. Now, and as a result of this, all businesses were put under increasing cost pressures. And higher education was by no means immune from this. And we had enormous pressures on universities, especially public universities, but to some extent privates, to increasingly cut costs. And what's the best way to cut costs? Use contingent workers, because tenured workers represent a fixed cost. And tenured workers get older, and as they get older, they cost more. And so one way to sort of deal with this cost issue is by hiring people who are temps, because temporary workers are by definition expendable. You use them when you need them, you get rid of them when you don't need them. And this was tied to the idea of universities are businesses with customers, as Randy Weingarten said. And by this time, the use of precarious work, temporary work, contracting out, privatization, was good business practices. So university leaders wanted to be good business people, and so what they did was they adopted the good business practices, and now temporary work, I mean, that's what you do. The idea of sticking to your knitting and focusing on your core function and outsourcing everything else, that's the way business works, and now it's taken as an obvious fact. Now, Leah mentioned this a bit. Let me talk a little bit more about it, and that is that precarious work is a global phenomenon. It is not restricted to the United States. It characterizes all developed industrial countries. Developing countries have always been precarious. If you look at India, for example, you have over 90% of the people there work in the informal economy, which is the extreme form of precarious work. But it's in these industrial countries that were characterized by a post-Keynesian welfare state that this is where you had the departure from the standard employment relationship, and this is where workers and individuals experienced a sense of loss. Now, all of these countries in Europe and in Asia, which I'm focusing on right now, experienced the same competitive pressures, but they responded in different ways depending on their labor market and welfare institutions. In the US and the UK, what Leah's called the liberal market economies, what you have basically is an increase in marketization across the board. Business was the victor, unions were the loser, the government was kind of weak, and so business basically did what they wanted to, and as a result, you have a removal of institutional protections from workers in general. In countries like Germany and Japan, you have a strong manufacturing core of workers around unions, and these guys protected their own interests by making deals with the state. And so they were relatively unprecarious, but it was the outsiders, the suppliers for manufacturing, the service workers, of course, immigrants that suffered so it was an insider-outsider dualism. In Spain, it was a little bit different because they have a lot of strong employment protections, and it's hard to get rid of people. So older people didn't want to leave because they couldn't get rid of them, and so therefore younger people can't get a foothold in the labor market, and that's a dualism as well. In countries like Denmark, which was sort of an exemplar of social democracy, Denmark also is experiencing liberalization, but because of a strong state and its history of social partnerships, they have developed more of a collectivization of risk policy, where, yeah, we have risk, yeah, we need flexibility, but let's provide security as a result of this risk. So in all these countries, you have a growth of liberalization of the economy, a return to economic liberalism. Now, in all these countries, you also had reactions to this. But I'm talking now about precarious work, but as Randy Weingart mentioned this morning, precarious work, and so Leo Casey did too, is related to other things like growth of inequality. These are all correlates of the same phenomenon. Now, first we had mass mobilizations. Remember a few years ago we had Occupy Wall Street? It started in Spain with the Indignados. These are young elite workers complaining about this. These were mass mobilizations. It occurred in all the countries. You occupied London. We had Occupy, I think, Chapel Hill. I think Guy Stanley came down and gave a spiel to the workers who were camped out. They went home when it was cold, but they were there for a while. We're all protesting. These are mass mobilizations. The problem with this, it never went anywhere because they explicitly did not tie themselves to a political movement. The Occupy Wall Street folks explicitly did not want to get connected with unions. So as a result, as Francis Piven and Richard Clower taught us, in order to be effective, you've got to link the mass mobilization to electoral politics. And sure enough, that's what's been happening. You've got these mass mobilizations. You have left-wing movements. You've got them in Japan. You've got them in Spain. You get them in Bernie Sanders. These are people who are angry at this. They're angry at they don't use the term precarious work. They'll talk about inequality, but they'll also talk about loss of opportunity, inability to get jobs. And of course, you get it from the right. You've got a right-wing, a very strong right-wing movement in Germany right now. You've got one in Denmark, and we have one here in the United States. I assume we can call the Donald Trump phenomenon right-wing, though it's not. It certainly has got right-wing elements, but it's not clear exactly what his perspectives are. So let me sum up a little bit. First of all, the events of 11/9, I think the events of 11/9 are going to be 9/11 backwards is going to be a turning point in this whole phenomenon. Trump is a reaction to the kinds of issues that I've just been talking about, especially among white men. Now, if you think about who had the most to lose from the standard employment relationship, it was white men. White men were the ones who had it because women were not really part of the SCR. Non-whites were never really part of the SCR. Women and non-whites, for example, were always precarious. But it was the white men who, the middle class auto worker in Detroit who had relatively low skill but had a good salary, these were the guys whose jobs became all of a sudden expendable and precarious, and this erupted in this very, very strong anger. Now, given Trump's pro-business, anti-regulation view, precarious work is likely to continue to be a problem. It's interesting to note that in the construction industry, the industry with which Trump has his experience, has always used precarious work. They've always had subcontracting models. And sometimes they don't even pay them when they do work for them. That's a smart way of doing business in the construction industry. So I don't expect things to really change all that much. So there's plenty of reason for pessimism. But there's also reason, and from a global perspective, it's pretty clear that economic globalization and the rapidity of technological change are pretty inexorable forces. I mean, we're not going to slow down technological change, and we shouldn't try. We're not going to shut down economic globalization. I mean, eventually we're going to run out of low-wage countries to sell our stuff to. I mean, China's now too expensive. We're selling our, now we're making our stuff in Vietnam and Burma and so on. And pretty soon we can go to Africa. But pretty soon we're going to run out of space. But the idea of globalization is going to be with us. But I think there are reasons for optimism. And one reason for that is that precarious work and its consequences are not determined by technology or globalization. Institutions clearly matter. If you look across the world, countries that have had labor market institutions that facilitate the movement of people back into the labor market, providing them with a degree of labor market, if not job security, and welfare policies that provide people with a sense of social protections, in those situations you've got precarious work, but the level of insecurity is not as high. And so social actors can make a difference. And that, I think, is a source of optimism. In countries, for example, with universal health coverage, which is most countries except the United States, and portable benefits of various kinds, the trend toward precarious work might not be that bad. I mean, precarious work, if you take the term generally, there are certain good things about it. It does provide people with a great deal of flexibility. Now, the problem with it is that with flexibility comes insecurity. If you don't have health insurance when you lose your job, if you get zapped out of the retirement system, if you get laid off and so on. But if we had these social protections, these are got to be beyond the labor market now. There are opportunities, even though work might continue to be precarious, the consequences of that will be less severe if we had the kinds of social protections. And of course, the key element in all of this is worker power, because worker power is the missing ingredient from the equation here. And that's why the kind of stuff that you guys are doing now in terms of organizing academics and organizing precarious workers more generally and trying to focus on changes in labor laws and so on are so important. These things do matter. And it looked pretty dark, too, at the dawn of the New Deal. I mean, if you go back and read some of the books from there, some of the quotes about how the world was falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the world's falling apart now too, but we got out of it then, and I think through our collective efforts, and there will be a brighter tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you.